She didn't come to Ashford Hall looking for love. She came because she had $11, one worn trunk, and nowhere left to go. When the horse reared and the little girl screamed, Clara Whitcomb didn't think she ran. She caught the child with both arms and went down hard in the mud. And when she looked up, the most feared man in 3 Virginia counties was standing over her in the rain, his jaw locked tight, his eyes saying something his mouth never would. If you've ever had to be strong when every bone in your body was breaking, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The carriage that brought Clara Whitcomb to Ashford Hall smelled like wet leather and old tobacco, and the driver hadn't spoken a single word in 40 minutes. That suited Clara fine. She wasn't in the mood for questions she couldn't answer honestly. She pressed her forehead against the rain-streaked window and watched Virginia roll past, green and heavy and endless, the kind of land that looked like it had been there since before God finished deciding what he wanted. The James River flashed silver between the trees, every few miles wide and indifferent. The road leading to the estate was lined with old oaks, their branches grown so thick over the path that the afternoon light barely made it through. Even in summer, even with everything in full leaf, the drive to Ashford Hall felt like riding into a storm. Clara told herself she wasn't afraid. She was lying. She had read the letter of employment twice on the stage from Richmond, and once more in the carriage holding it close to the window for light. The terms were fair, more than fair frankly for a woman in her position. Room and board, a modest salary. The charge of one child, female age 7, who had shown, quote, considerable difficulty with formal instruction. The letter was signed by one R. Bellamy housekeeper on behalf of Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, master of Ashford Hall. Not signed by Nathaniel Ashford himself. Clara had noted that detail the first time. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. Her closest friend in Boston had gotten married in April and moved to Connecticut. Her landlady had already rented Clara's room to a printer's widow. And her mother, well. Her mother had stopped waiting on Clara's prospects 2 years ago when Clara turned 26 without a husband and showed no visible signs of correcting the situation. So here she was, Virginia. An estate she'd never seen, a child she'd never met, a master who didn't sign his own correspondence. And behind her in the luggage rack, one worn leather trunk containing everything she owned in the world. The carriage slowed. The driver muttered something under his breath. Clara straightened, pulled her damp traveling jacket tighter, and looked through the window. Ashford Hall was enormous. 3 stories of red brick and white columns set back from a sweep of lawn that must have been magnificent before neglect had its way with it. The formal garden to the left was overgrown hedges, unpruned roses, gone to briar. The gravel drive was patchy with weeds. 2 of the front windows were shuttered even in midday. The place had the particular look of a house that had stopped caring about itself, not poor exactly, but grieving. Clara had seen that look before. She recognized it. She was still looking at the house when the front door burst open. A child came flying out of it, no coat, no shoes. Her dark hair streaming loose behind her, running like something was chasing her. She hit the front steps at a dead sprint and kept going. Her bare feet scattering gravel, heading straight for the carriage road without looking. The carriage horse reared. Clara heard the driver shout. She heard the child scream not in pain, but in pure animal terror, that particular sound children make when they realize they've run into something they can't outrun. The horse came down hard on the front of its hooves, the whole carriage lurching sideways, and Clara was already moving. She didn't decide to move. Her body decided for her. She hit the carriage door at a shoulder, shoved it open mid-rock, and she was on the ground before the vehicle fully stopped, mud soaking through her skirt at the knees, gravel biting her palms. The child was right there 5 feet from the horse's stamping front legs, frozen, her face white as paper. Clara grabbed her, both arms around the girl's shoulders, spinning hard, taking the child with her away from the horse and down to the ground, in one movement, rolling them both clear. The horse screamed again. Something clipped Clara's left shoulder, hoof or wheel, she couldn't tell. She pulled the child tighter and kept rolling until they were off the drive entirely into the wet grass at the edge, and then she stopped. She lay there for a moment with her cheek against the wet grass and a 7-year-old pressed against her chest, both of them breathing like they'd run a mile. Then she heard the voice. "Put her down!" It wasn't a shout. That was the thing. It was low-controlled and so absolutely cold that Clara felt it in her back teeth. She lifted her head. Nathaniel Ashford was standing at the top of the front steps. She had expected she didn't know what she had expected. Something softer, maybe. Something that matched the polite impersonality of the employment letter. What she got was a man who looked like he had been built for a harder century and was merely tolerating this one. Tall, dark-coated, jaw set like he'd decided to clench it at 19 and never unclenched it since. He was already coming down the steps, moving fast, for a man who kept his face that still, and his eyes, dark, sharp, furious, were locked on the child in Clara's arms. Not on Clara, on the child. Clara had just enough time to recognize that before he was standing over her. Up close, he was worse or better, she couldn't decide which. The fury in his face was the kind that came from fear, not cruelty. She'd grown up around her father long enough to know the difference. "I said put her down," he repeated. "In a moment," Clara said. The silence that followed was spectacular. She heard a door open somewhere behind her. She heard someone on the front steps make a small, horrified sound. She did not, under any circumstances, look away from Nathaniel Ashford's face, because she was fairly certain that if she looked away first, she would never get it back. He stared at her. She stared back. The child between them was trembling. "Lydia," he said, shifting his eyes to the girl, and his voice dropped half a register into something that was not quite warmth, but was trying to reach it. "Are you hurt?" The child. Lydia shook her head against Clara's collarbone. "Then stand up." "She's shaking," Clara said flatly and factually, like she was reporting the weather. His eyes came back to her. "I didn't ask your assessment." "No, sir, you didn't." Clara shifted Lydia, carefully checking the child's legs, her ankles, her hands, the way she held herself, looking for the particular stiffness that meant something had been twisted, or worse. Lydia let her do it, without pulling away, which told Clara something she filed away for later. "But I'm giving it regardless, because I caught her about 4 seconds before your horse put a hoof through her, and I'd like to know she's whole before I hand her over." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Nathaniel Ashford did something Clara had not expected. He crouched down, right there in the wet gravel in his good coat, until he was at eye level with Lydia. His hand came up and brushed a strand of wet hair from the girl's face with a gentleness that was at complete war with everything else about him. "Liddy," he said quietly, "tell me." "I'm all right, Uncle Nathaniel," Lydia whispered. "I am." She caught me. He looked at Clara then, and for one unguarded moment something crossed his face that she couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was more like a man looking at something he didn't have the language for yet. Then it was gone. He straightened up. The mask came back. He held out his hand to help Clara to her feet. She took it because her knees were unsteady, and her pride wasn't worth a broken ankle. The moment she was upright, he released her hand, took a clean step back, and put exactly the right amount of aristocratic distance between them. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Ashford," she said. She was very aware that she was covered in mud from the elbow down, and that her hair had escaped its pin somewhere during the rolling and was hanging loose across her right shoulder. She didn't touch it. "You're late." The stage from Richmond was delayed. There was a wheel problem outside of Charlottesville. "I was told you'd arrive by noon." "I was told I'd arrive by noon as well," Clara said. "I shared your disappointment from inside the carriage." He looked at her for a moment, like she was a mathematical problem he hadn't expected to find on the page. Then he turned to the woman who had appeared at his shoulder, small, stout, gray-haired with a face that had made peace with most of the world's unpleasantness and was managing the remainder with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Bellamy Clara, guessed even before the woman opened her mouth. "I'll see Miss Whitcomb's trunk brought in," Mrs. Bellamy said, with the tone of someone who had been quietly running things for 20 years and intended to continue. "See that she's shown to her room," Nathaniel said. He looked at Clara one more time. "We'll discuss your duties this evening. 6 o'clock. "Of course," Clara said. He walked back toward the house. Lydia had not moved from Clara's side. The child was watching her uncle's retreating back with an expression Clara couldn't read, not quite fear, not quite relief. Something in between worn smooth from repetition. "Does he always walk away like that?" Clara asked. Lydia looked up at her. She had gray eyes, serious and too old for her face. "Like what?" "Like he's already decided how a thing ends before it begins." Lydia thought about it. "Yes," she said finally. "I reckon he does." Clara looked down at the child and decided right there in the wet grass of a stranger's front lawn that she liked her very much. Mrs. Bellamy gave Clara a tour of the house that felt less like hospitality and more like a briefing. 3 floors, 12 rooms in active use, the rest shut and sheeted. Kitchen garden to the east. Stables to the north. Greenhouse attached to the west wing. Mr. Ashford's particular domain, not to be entered without invitation. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. Miss Lydia's schoolroom was on the 2nd floor, east-facing good morning light. "How many before me?" Clara asked as they climbed the stairs. Mrs. Bellamy's stride didn't break. 6. "And they all left?" "They did." "Why?" The housekeeper stopped on the landing and looked at Clara with the frank, measuring look of a woman who'd been around long enough to decide whether honesty was worth the trouble. Apparently, Clara passed whatever test she was running because Mrs. Bellamy let out a breath and said, 3 left because Mr. Ashford frightened them. 1 left because Miss Lydia bit her. Bit her, on the hand, during a reading lesson. Mrs. Bellamy resumed walking. The 5th left because she wrote to her sister in Baltimore saying the house was haunted, and the 6th... She paused, pushed open a door. The 6th left because she wrote to Mr. Ashford's cousin in Richmond, suggesting that Miss Lydia required an institution, not a schoolroom. Mr. Ashford read the letter before it was sent. Clara considered this. What did he do? He dismissed her on the spot and told her she had 20 minutes to be off the property. Mrs. Bellamy said it with something that was almost satisfaction. I packed her things myself. The room they'd entered was bright and square with 2 tall windows and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in some time. There was a single bed, a writing desk, a washstand, and a row of hooks on the wall that still held the ghost impression of someone else's coats. It's a good room, Clara said. It was the music teacher's room 15 years ago. Mrs. Bellamy set a towel on the washstand. Before Mrs. Ashford passed. Mr. Ashford's wife? His sister. The housekeeper's voice went careful, the way people's voices went when they were choosing which parts of a story to give you. Lydia's mother. She died 4 years ago. A fever. A pause. It was very sudden. Clara looked at the fireplace. 4 years. The child would have been 3. Old enough to remember something not in language maybe, but in body, in bone, in the specific gravity of loss that settled into a child who learned too early that the people you loved could simply stop being there one morning. And Mr. Ashford took Lydia in, Clara said. There was no one else. Has he always been? She stopped, reconsidered. Is he like this with most people? Mrs. Bellamy looked at her. It was a look that said, You're going to be here longer than 6 weeks. So I'll give you the truth and let you do what you like with it. Mr. Ashford was a state senator before the trouble, she said. Well respected, well liked even, which is not a thing that comes easily in this county. Then his wife died, his wife first Eleanor, and then his sister Marion, 2 years later, and there was a business matter in Richmond that went wrong in ways I won't pretend to fully understand, and after all of it he came home to this house with Lydia and closed most of the doors. She smoothed a wrinkle from the bed cover. He is not a cruel man, Miss Whitcomb. He is a man who has gotten very good at being alone. Clara set her traveling bag on the desk. And Miss Lydia. She's a good child. Clever as anything when she wants to be. Mrs. Bellamy moved toward the door. She doesn't want to be for lessons. You'll find out why soon enough. What do you mean? The housekeeper stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She turned back once, and there was something tired and sad in her face that hadn't been there before. She knows her letters. She's known them since she was 5. She simply refuses to put them together. A beat. The last teacher told Mr. Ashford the child was dim-witted. He told her she was mistaken. The teacher disagreed. She paused. That was the one he gave 20 minutes. Clara looked out the window down at the overgrown front garden, where she could just make out Lydia sitting on the lowest step, pulling at a piece of grass with focused determination. She's not dim-witted, Clara said. No, Mrs. Bellamy agreed quietly. She isn't. Yet, 6 o'clock came. Clara had changed into her better dress, which wasn't much better, but it was dry, and pinned her hair back with more success than it deserved, and made her way downstairs to what Mrs. Bellamy had called the study. She knocked. Come in. Nathaniel Ashford was standing by the fireplace with a ledger open on the mantel. Though he wasn't reading it, he was looking at the fire. When Clara entered, he turned, and for a moment she had the peculiar impression of watching a man rearrange himself, not his clothing, but something less visible, some expression or posture that he'd let slip in the absence of company. Sit down, Miss Whitcomb, he said. There were 2 chairs by the fireplace. Clara chose the one that didn't look like his, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap with the particular calmness of a woman who had learned that appearing calm was sometimes better than feeling it. He remained standing. You're from Massachusetts, he said, not a question. Boston, sir. I taught at a small school on Cornhill Street for 3 years before it closed. Why did it close? The proprietor died. His son sold the building. She paused. I was looking for a new position when your letter found me. Mrs. Bellamy's letter, he corrected. Yes, Mrs. Bellamy's letter. He watched her for a moment in the way that she was already beginning to identify as particular to him. Not rude exactly, but measuring like he was trying to calculate a value he didn't trust himself to name correctly. You've been told about the previous teachers, he said. 6, Clara said. I know. Then you understand why I have reservations. I'd be more concerned if you didn't, she said. A man with no reservations is either very confident or not paying attention. 6 teachers is a significant number. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but the faint, reluctant attention of a man who hadn't expected to be surprised, and found he wasn't entirely displeased. Lydia is my responsibility, he said. She's been through enough difficulty that I won't have her subjected to more on account of a teacher's impatience or her own stubbornness. If you find at any point that the situation is beyond your... It isn't, Clara said. He stopped. I was still speaking. I know. But you were about to give me an opening to leave early, and I wanted to close it before you finished making it. She met his eyes steadily. I've read enough about children to understand that a 7-year-old who won't read usually has a reason that has nothing to do with reading. I spent 20 minutes watching Lydia from my window this afternoon, and I can tell you that whatever the reason is, it isn't stupidity and it isn't disobedience. The fire crackled. Outside, the summer evening was settling, the light going long and gold across the grass. What is it then? Nathaniel asked, and his voice was quieter than it had been. I don't know yet, Clara said honestly. I need time with her before I can answer that. How much time? As much as she needs. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fire, and she understood that the meeting was concluding, even if he hadn't said so. Breakfast at 7, he said. Miss Lydia takes her meals with me. You'll join us. A pause. Lessons begin at 9. Yes, sir. And Miss Whitcomb. She stood. Sir? He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still watching the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw in its habitual set. What you did today, with the horse. A pause. It was well done. It was the closest thing to gratitude she suspected she was going to get, and she accepted it without fanfare. It was reflex, she said. I didn't think. Most people would have. He was quiet for a moment. Thought and done nothing. Clara walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when she said, "Then it's fortunate, Mr. Ashford, that I've never been especially good at thinking before I act." She didn't wait to see if he responded. She pulled the door closed behind her and stood alone in the hallway for a moment, pressing her left hand against the wall and breathing. Her shoulder was going to be spectacular colors tomorrow. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of discomfort, and then she walked upstairs to her room. Lydia came to find her at 8 o'clock. Clara was at the desk unpacking the contents of her trunk in deliberate order books. First, then the small box of teaching materials she'd brought from Boston, then the folded clothes, then the 2 personal items she'd allowed herself: a portrait miniature of her father and a single pressed wildflower from the meadow behind the last house where she'd been genuinely happy, which was a long time ago now. She heard the knock, tentative, barely a knock, more like knuckles changing their mind halfway through, and said, "Come in." Lydia opened the door about 4 inches and stood in the gap, wearing a white nightgown too big for her and holding a candle in both hands with great seriousness. "Can't sleep?" Clara asked. Lydia shook her head. "Neither could I first night in a new place." Clara gestured to the edge of the bed. "Sit if you like." Lydia came in. She sat on the corner of the bed with her feet dangling and the candle balanced on her knees, which was not a safe arrangement, and Clara very carefully did not say so. "You didn't scream," Lydia said after a moment. Clara looked up from the book she was setting in order. "When? With the horse, earlier." Lydia was watching her with those grave gray eyes. "The others always scream at me when I do something wrong." "I was too busy catching you to scream," Clara said. "The last teacher," Lydia said carefully, "cried. After She stopped. "After something happened." "Mrs. Bellamy told me," Clara said neutrally. Lydia went very still. "She told you I bit her." "She did." The child waited. Clara kept unpacking books. After a long moment, Lydia said in a very small voice, "Aren't you going to ask why?" "Not tonight," Clara said. "It's late, and it's your business until you want it to be mine." Lydia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost too old for her face. "Most grown-ups don't say that." "Most grown-ups are in too much of a hurry," Clara said. She placed the last book on the desk and turned to look at the child properly. Lydia was thin in the way that children who didn't eat enough at meals were thin, or children who spent too much of their energy on worrying. Her hair, now clean and braided for bed, was dark and straight. She had her uncle's jaw, the same line of it, stubborn and held tight. "Lydia," Clara said, "may I ask you something?" A small nod. "You know the alphabet. Mrs. Bellamy says you've known it for 2 years. Lydia's hands tightened on the candle. "Yes." "But you won't read in lessons." No answer. "That's all I wanted to ask," Clara said. "I'm not asking why. I just wanted you to know I understand the difference between can't and won't. And I want you to know that I'm not here to make you feel ashamed of whichever one it is." Lydia looked at the floor. Her chin did something complicated that it was trying very hard not to do. "My mama used to read to me," she said very quietly. "Every night. Before." Clara didn't say anything. She waited. "She'd read until I fell asleep." Lydia's voice was barely there. "And when I woke up, she'd be gone, back to her own room. But I always knew—" She stopped, started again. "I always knew she'd been there because the book would be on the table beside the bed, closed, with her bookmark in it." The candle flame trembled. "The last teacher said—" Lydia's jaw tightened. "She said I needed to put childish things aside. She said holding on to sadness was weakness." "She was wrong," Clara said. Lydia looked up. "Holding on to the people we love is not weakness," Clara said. "It is the most human thing we do." She paused. I think that reading felt like a door to your mama, and someone told you to close it. She paused again. Am I wrong? Lydia shook her head. A single tear had gotten past whatever guard she was keeping and was making its way down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, which told Clara that the child was either very brave or very used to not showing weakness in front of adults. Possibly both. We don't have to open that door tomorrow, Clara said. We don't have to open it for a while, but I want you to know. She held Lydia's gaze. It's your door, not anyone else's. And when you're ready, you choose how it opens. Not me, not your uncle, you. Lydia was quiet for a long time. Then she climbed off the bed, walked to Clara's desk, and looked at the row of books Clara had just arranged. What are those? She asked. Books, Clara said. Some for lessons, some just for reading. That one. Lydia pointed to a thin volume, green-covered, worn at the spine. That one has stories about rivers, Clara said. The Ohio, the Mississippi, the James, about the people who traveled them. Lydia looked at the book for a long moment. The James River is at the bottom of the East Meadow, she said. Uncle Nathaniel won't let me go there alone. I don't blame him, Clara said. But perhaps we could go together sometime. Lesson or no lesson. Lydia looked at her for the first time with something other than careful assessment. Something younger and braver and very much like hope. All right, she said. Maybe. She picked up her candle and walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped. Miss Whitcomb. Yes. I'm glad you didn't scream. I'm glad you weren't hurt, Clara said. Good night, Lydia. Good night. The door closed. Clara sat in the quiet of her new room, in a house full of locked doors and grieving silences in the first summer of a life she hadn't planned and couldn't yet read the shape of. She looked at the green book on the desk. Then she looked at the door. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a single line in the small journal she kept. The child is not the problem. The child is the whole point. Outside somewhere on the dark grounds of Ashford Hall, a mockingbird started up loud and insistent and completely sure of itself, and sang until the first pale edge of morning began to show above the James River oaks. The first morning of lessons lasted exactly 11 minutes. Clara had arrived at the schoolroom at 8:45, moved the single chair away from the desk, rearranged the two smaller chairs to face each other. No desk between them, no barrier, and set the Green River book on the windowsill, where the light hit it open to the first page like an invitation rather than an assignment. She'd pulled the curtain back on the east window and let the summer morning pour in warm and direct the kind of light that made a room feel honest. Lydia walked in at 9, exactly saw the arrangement and stopped. Where's the desk? She said. I moved it, Clara said. Why? Because I don't like teaching with furniture between me and my student. Clara sat down in one of the chairs and gestured at the other. Sit down, Lydia. Lydia sat. She held herself very straight the way children did when they were braced for something unpleasant. We're not going to read today, Clara said. Lydia blinked. We're not... No. Today I want you to tell me about the river. A pause. The James. You told me last night it was at the bottom of the East Meadow. Tell me about it. Lydia looked at her with the particular caution of a child who'd been tricked before, led gently into topics that turned out to be lessons in disguise games that became tests without warning. Clara held the girl's gaze and didn't flinch. What do you want to know? Lydia asked slowly. Everything you know. How wide is it at the shallow crossing? Wide enough to get your skirt wet to the knee, Lydia said immediately, and then looked startled by her own answer, like she'd moved before she meant to. And deep at the bend. Deep enough that Cook won't let Thomas the stable boy swim there. He tried last August and she found out, and... Lydia stopped. Then cautiously the beginning of something that might become a smile. She hit him with a spoon. A wooden spoon. A very large wooden spoon. The maybe smile got slightly more definite. He said it was an accident. Cook said if swimming in a deep river bend with no one watching was an accident, then so was the spoon. Clara laughed. A real laugh, not a teacher's laugh, the kind that came from the stomach unrehearsed, and Lydia looked so startled by it that she almost fell off the chair. "All right," Clara said. "Now I'm going to show you something." She reached across and picked up the green book, turned to a page near the middle, and held it out. "See that line there? The one that starts with the James?" Lydia looked at the page. Her shoulders came up slightly. "I see it," she said warily. "Read it to me." "I told you You told me you won't," Clara said gently but precisely. "You didn't say you can't. Read it, Lydia. Just that one line." Silence. A long one. Lydia's jaw did the same complicated thing it had done the night before, fighting itself, fighting whatever was sitting on top of those letters like a stone. Then barely above a whisper, haltingly, "The James River runs 140 miles. She stopped. Her hands were shaking in her lap. "That's enough," Clara said quietly. She took the book back, closed it, set it on the windowsill. "That's enough for today." Lydia stared at her. That's it. But I only read one line." "You read one line you've never read before," Clara said. "That's one more than yesterday. We'll do 2 tomorrow." Lydia looked at the closed book. Then she looked at Clara with those 2 old gray eyes and said, "You're strange, Miss Whitcomb." "I've been told that," Clara agreed. "By people I respected and people I didn't. It evens out." That was when the door opened. Not all the way. Just enough 4 or 5 inches the particular gap of a man who hadn't decided whether he was entering or not. Clara didn't look up immediately. She heard the floorboard, knew the weight of it. She waited. Nathaniel Ashford stood in the half-open door of the schoolroom and looked at his niece, sitting in a chair without a desk in front of her, holding a book she'd actually touched, talking to a woman who was laughing without permission. "Lesson concluded," he said. "For today," Clara said. "It's 9:15. "Yes, sir." She stood, smoothed her skirt. "Lydia and I had a productive 11 minutes. Isn't that right, Lydia?" Lydia looked up at her uncle with something she was trying to keep off her face. It looked a great deal like wanting him to ask, wanting him to care enough to ask, and being afraid he wouldn't. Nathaniel looked at his niece for a moment. Then stiffly, like the question cost him something. "What did you study?" "Rivers," Lydia said. A beat. "Rivers." "The James specifically," Clara said. "We're planning to cover the Ohio and the Mississippi before the month is out." "We," Nathaniel repeated. "Miss Whitcomb says we might go to the riverbank," Lydia said, and Clara heard the careful neutrality in the child's voice, presenting the information without hope, because hoping for things that adults then refused was a particular kind of pain she was already fluent in. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Clara looked back. "We'll discuss the riverbank," Clara said, which was not a promise and not a refusal, and which seemed to satisfy something in Lydia that didn't know how to handle either. Nathaniel stepped back from the door, closed it without another word. Clara and Lydia sat in the quiet room and listened to his footsteps go down the hallway. "He won't say yes," Lydia said. "He didn't say no," Clara said. By the end of the first week, 3 things had happened. Lydia was reading 2 lines a day without being told, and had started asking questions about rivers, the way other children asked questions about sweets, constant, unpredictable, slightly inconvenient. She wanted to know how rivers chose their direction. She wanted to know if rivers got tired. She wanted to know what happened to a river if you dammed it. Clara had answered all of these questions honestly, which meant she'd twice had to say, "I don't know. Let's find out." And she'd taken Lydia to Mrs. Bellamy's small personal library, which turned out to contain 2 surprisingly good volumes on American geography and 1 excellent almanac from 1809. The second thing that happened was that the household staff started looking at Clara differently. Not warmly, not yet, but with the particular careful attention of people who'd watched a parade of women fail at something, and were beginning to wonder cautiously and privately whether this one might not. Thomas, the stable boy, who was 17 and had the build of someone who'd grown 6 inches in 6 months, and hadn't finished being surprised by. It had taken to leaving the east door unlatched in the mornings so that Clara and Lydia could get to the garden without going around the long way. He'd never mentioned it. Clara had never mentioned it. They had an unspoken agreement of the kind that forms between people who understand each other without requiring explanations. The third thing was Nathaniel Ashford. He began appearing in doorways, not entering, never fully entering. But the door to the schoolroom would be 3 inches open during lessons, and Clara could feel the particular quality of attention from the hall. Not surveillance, she was almost certain of it, but something closer to a man standing outside a warm room and trying to decide if he had the right to go in. She didn't acknowledge it. She taught. She let Lydia talk about the river and about the old horse in the north paddock named General, who was 23 years old and had the personality of a judge. She let the lessons wander where Lydia's mind wandered, and she pulled them back to letters and words and numbers through the geography of the child's own interests. The way you'd guide a river, not by blocking it, but by shaping the banks on either side. On Thursday of the first week, she came to the schoolroom to find a book she hadn't placed there sitting on the windowsill. It was a volume on the rivers of the American frontier, published in 1812. The binding was good. The maps inside were detailed and clear. Someone had tucked a small paper inside the front cover with 3 rivers circled in ink: the Ohio, the Wabash, and the Cumberland, and below them in handwriting that was spare and precise, and tried not to call attention to itself a single line. These cross the territory Lydia asked about last Monday. Clara stared at the note for a long moment. She hadn't told anyone what Lydia had asked about last Monday. She'd been alone with the child, which meant Nathaniel Ashford had been standing in that hallway long enough to hear the question had gone away, and found the relevant book, and had left it without signing his name or seeking any acknowledgement. Clara put the note back inside the cover and set the book beside the green one on the windowsill. She didn't mention it to Lydia. Lydia found it herself 15 minutes into the lesson, picked it up, looked at the maps and said, "This is a good one." "It is," Clara agreed. "Where did it come from?" "Someone who was listening," Clara said. Lydia looked at the door. It was closed. She looked back at the book, and something in her face went careful and quiet and private. "Oh," she said softly, "and good." The first real confrontation happened on a Friday evening after dinner. Clara had taken to walking the East Garden after the evening meal because the August heat broke around 7, and the air coming off the James River had the particular quality that she had decided was the best thing about Virginia: cool and green, and carrying something older than anyone living. She wasn't looking for company. She wasn't expecting it. But Nathaniel Ashford was already there. He was standing at the low stone wall at the garden's far edge, looking out at the direction of the river, his coat off, and his sleeves turned back in the way of a man who'd forgotten for a moment that there were people around to notice. He heard her footsteps and turned, and the brief, unguarded moment she caught was the same one she'd seen in the study on her first night, something that had accidentally risen to the surface before the mask came back. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She stopped a respectful distance away. "I didn't know you used the East Garden." "I don't generally." He turned back to the view. "I was at the greenhouse. Lost track of the hour." The greenhouse. She'd passed its glass walls from the outside, seen the light inside even late in the evenings. Seen his silhouette moving through it. She'd asked Mrs. Bellamy once what he grew in there, and the housekeeper had said, "Orange trees mostly, though they're not doing well." He doesn't talk about it. "Lydia tells me," Nathaniel said without looking at her, "that you've been teaching her through the garden." "Some lessons, yes. She knows the names of 43 plants in this garden alone, and can explain the growth patterns of at least a dozen. She wasn't retaining written material in the schoolroom, so I took the writing outside." Clara paused. "She carved her name into a piece of bark last Wednesday, without being asked, just to try." A silence. He was very still. "Did she?" he said. "She did. All 6 letters correct order." Clara let that sit. Then, "She's not what they told you she was, Mr. Ashford." He turned to look at her then, and his face was doing that complicated thing again. The thing she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but the opposite of it, a man trying very hard to keep feeling at a distance because feeling had cost him too much too recently. "What did they tell me she was?" he said quietly. "Incapable, slow, resistant to instruction." Clara met his gaze. "She's none of those things. She's a 7-year-old who lost her mother and was then told systematically that her grief was inconvenient. She stopped reading because reading was your sister's, and no one thought to ask her why before telling her she was wrong to feel it." The words landed harder than Clara had intended them to. She watched them land. Watched something move across his face, not anger, she didn't think. Something older and quieter than anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded more like a man trying to believe his own words than a man who did. "Perhaps not entirely," Clara said. "I've known Lydia 1 week, but I know what a child looks like when she's carrying something too heavy for her age. And I know what it looks like when the adults around her are too busy carrying their own weight to notice hers." She stopped. She'd gone further than she meant to. "I beg your pardon, that was impertinent." "It was," Nathaniel said. And then after a pause that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, "It was also not entirely wrong." Clara said nothing. She understood by instinct that this was not the moment for words. Nathaniel looked back toward the river. His hands were loose at his sides, which was the first time she'd seen that. Usually he held them clasped behind his back, or clenched at his coat pockets, something always held, always controlled. "Her mother," he said finally. "Marion, she made things feel possible, even when they weren't." A pause. "She used to read to Lydia every night. I could hear them from the hallway sometimes. Marion doing the voices." "Lydia told me," Clara said softly. He turned to look at her sharp and sudden. "She told you. The first night. She came to my room." Clara hesitated. "She told me her mother left the book on the table after she fell asleep. So Lydia would know she'd been there." Something happened in Nathaniel Ashford's face that Clara did not think she was supposed to see. She looked away at the garden wall and gave him a moment with it. When she looked back, his expression was closed again, but differently. Not the controlled blankness of earlier, but the rawness of a wound being pressed closed by sheer effort. "I didn't know that," he said. "About the book. Children keep things," Clara said gently. "It doesn't mean they're hiding from us. It means the things are precious." He was quiet for a long moment. The summer evening moved around them indifferent and beautiful, and somewhere down the slope toward the river, something was making noise in the oak trees, birds settling or wind, or the house itself exhaling after a long day. "The book on the windowsill," Clara said. "In the schoolroom. Thank you." He looked at her sharply. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not," Clara said. "Good night, Mr. Ashford." She walked back toward the house. She heard him say nothing. She did not look back. But she was almost certain that she heard him exhale long and slow, the way a man did when he'd been holding his breath without knowing it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Bellamy brought it to Clara at breakfast with the particular careful-handedness of someone delivering something they'd already assessed and formed an opinion about. The seal on the outside was pressed in deep red wax with an ornate V, not a family she recognized. The handwriting on the address was narrow and elegant, and somehow managed to convey condescension through penmanship alone. Miss C. Whitcomb, Ashford Hall, Virginia. No further courtesies. Clara opened it at the breakfast table which she shared with Lydia, and further down, Nathaniel, who was reading his own correspondence with the focus of a man who used productivity as a hedge against conversation. Lydia was eating a piece of toast with the methodical dedication of someone conserving energy for later activity. Neither of them appeared to notice the letter. Clara read it. Then she folded it, set it beside her plate, and picked up her fork. "Bad news?" Lydia asked. "Not particularly," Clara said. just information." "From who?" "A Miss Abigail Vane," Clara said, and she watched involuntarily. She couldn't help it to see if the name registered across the table. It did. Nathaniel did not look up from his correspondence, but his hand holding the edge of the paper went very slightly still. "Abigail Vane is the daughter of Judge Clement Vane of Richmond," Mrs. Bellamy said from the doorway. Too quickly, Clara noted which meant the housekeeper had known the letter was coming and had decided to let events unfold rather than intervene. "An old family. The Vanes and the Ashfords have known each other many years." "I see," Clara said pleasantly. "What does she want?" Lydia asked with the bluntness of a child who hadn't learned yet to pretend questions weren't questions. "She wants to introduce herself," Clara said. "She and her mother are planning to visit Ashford Hall at the end of the month." She picked up her fork. "She also wanted to advise me very kindly that she's aware of my position here, and that she hopes I'll find the work appropriately satisfying for a woman of my particular circumstances." Clara took a bite of egg. She was extremely polite about it. Lydia frowned. "That sounds like an insult." "It is," Clara said. "A very practiced one." Nathaniel set down his correspondence. He looked at Clara directly, which was less common than it should have been for a man who claimed to run his household with precision. "Miss Vane is—" He stopped, started again. "Her family and mine have a long association." "I'm sure," Clara said. "Her visit has been planned for some time." "Of course." "If she has caused any—" "Mr. Ashford," Clara said, setting down her own fork. "Miss Vane has not caused any offense. She has simply made clear in very gracious language that she considers herself the rightful center of this household's attention, and that I should position myself accordingly." She met his eyes. "I mention it only because Lydia asked. I have no intention of rearranging my behavior on account of a woman I haven't met." Nathaniel stared at her. Lydia had gone very still in her chair, watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she couldn't name all the parts of it. "She's going to try to be my new mother," Lydia said quietly, to no one in particular. The table went silent. Nathaniel turned to his niece. "Lydia, she came before," Lydia said, still in that same flat factual tone, the tone of a child reporting something they've already made their peace with being sad about. "2 years ago for a week. She brought me a doll. I don't like dolls. She told me I should." A pause. "She talked about Mama, like Mama was a mistake that had happened to the family." The silence after that was the loudest thing Clara had heard in Ashford Hall. Nathaniel's face was doing the thing it did when feeling was fighting its way to the surface against his will. He said tightly, "That isn't fair." "I know," Lydia said. "She did it anyway." Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Lydia. And in the space between the three of them, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way foundations shift, underground, irreversible, no longer ignorable. "We'll discuss Miss Vane's visit separately," Nathaniel said in a voice that was attempting control and mostly achieving it. "Yes, sir," Clara said. She picked her fork back up. "Lydia, eat your toast. We have rivers to cover this morning." Lydia looked down at her plate. Then she looked up at Clara, and the thing in her face was not hope. Exactly. Hope was too light a word for it. It was more like a person reaching for a handhold and finding one solid. She ate her toast. The second twist came that same afternoon, and it came from a direction Clara hadn't been watching. She was in the hallway outside the small drawing room looking for Mrs. Bellamy to ask about the laundry arrangement when she heard voices inside. Not loud voices. The particular low, careful tone of a conversation that was trying not to carry. She wasn't eavesdropping. She told herself this clearly as she slowed and stopped outside the half-open door. The voice she heard first belonged to Mr. Patterson Nathaniel's estate manager, a thin, dry-voiced man of 50, who had the manner of a clerk and the instincts Clara had decided of something slightly less trustworthy. The Vane connection would solve a good deal, Patterson was saying. The eastern property alone. I'm aware, Nathaniel said. The family in Richmond isn't going to wait indefinitely. Judge Vane is not a patient man, and his daughter. I said I'm aware, Patterson. A pause. The position is precarious, sir. Since the business with Senator Marchland, your influence in Richmond. You're testing my patience. I'm protecting your interests, Patterson said, unmoved. The schoolmistress. Clara went very still. What about her? Nathaniel said. It was not a question. It was a warning with a question's shape. The household is talking, Patterson said. Not critically, I don't mean that. But a woman of her station living in close proximity, and Miss Vane expected at month's end. He stopped delicately. It might be prudent to clarify the arrangement, publicly. A long pause. The arrangement is clear, Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that Clara had learned meant the conversation was about to end. Miss Whitcomb is Lydia's teacher, that is all. And if anyone in this household is discussing anything else, you can make it known that I don't pay people to speculate about my domestic arrangements. Of course, sir. And Patterson. The sound of a chair, someone standing. If I hear Miss Whitcomb's name used in any context that requires clarifying, the next conversation I have will be about your arrangement here. Are we clear? A pause. Quite clear, sir. Clara moved away from the door before she heard anything more. She walked down the hallway to the east stairs, climbed them, and stood at the top for a moment with one hand on the newel post, breathing. He'd defended her. Without being asked, without knowing she was there, without an audience to perform it for. She tried to decide what that meant, and concluded sensibly that it meant exactly one thing: he was a fair man. An infuriating, armored, frequently impossible fair man who left books on windowsills without signing his name, and defended poor schoolmistresses in rooms he thought were private. She was furious at herself for how much that mattered. She pushed off the newel post and walked to the schoolroom. Lydia was already there, sitting in her chair with the river book open on her knees, not reading it yet, just holding it the way she held things she was working up to. You're early, Clara said. I finished the map of the Ohio, Lydia said without looking up. I wanted to start the Cumberland. Clara sat down across from her and said nothing. She watched Lydia's mouth move slightly as her eyes tracked across the page, following the lines of text, the child's finger resting very lightly on the river's illustrated path, feeling the shape of the words, even while she read them silently, already reading. And not even Clara thought noticing that she was. Outside, the August afternoon pressed heavy and gold against the windows of Ashford Hall, and somewhere in the west wing, in the greenhouse where orange trees were dying slowly in incorrect soil, a man was working alone with his hands, doing the only thing he knew how to do when the world became too much to manage. Clara looked at Lydia. She looked at the closed door. She thought about books left without signatures and conversations had in private rooms. She picked up her pen and started planning tomorrow's lesson. She told herself firmly and repeatedly that there was absolutely nothing else to think about. She did not entirely succeed. Miss Abigail Vane arrived on a Wednesday, which Clara would later think was appropriate because Wednesday was neither the beginning nor the end of anything. It was the middle, the hinge, the part of the week that committed to nothing and could go either direction without apology. She came in a carriage that was newer and better appointed than anything in the Ashford stable, with her mother beside her and two manservants riding behind, and she stepped down onto the gravel drive of Ashford Hall with the particular grace of a woman who had practiced arriving places her whole life. She was beautiful in the way that certain cold mornings were beautiful, clear, precise, and not especially interested in your comfort. Clara watched from the upstairs hallway window. She wasn't hiding. She simply had no reason to go down. Lydia appeared at her elbow without announcement. She's here, the child said. I can see that. Lydia watched the woman below smooth her traveling skirt, accept Nathaniel's hand from the carriage step, and turned to survey the front of the house with an expression that managed to be evaluating and complimentary at exactly the same time. She's prettier than I remembered, Lydia said flatly. Pretty is a coat, Clara said. It tells you what someone wants you to see, not who they are. Lydia considered this. "What does ugly tell you?" "Usually the truth," Clara said, though not always a flattering one. She stepped back from the window. "Come. We have a lesson." "Aren't we going down to greet her?" "Mrs. Bellamy is greeting her. That's Mrs. Bellamy's job." Clara walked toward the schoolroom. "Our job is Rivers. We still haven't finished the Cumberland." Lydia followed her, but slowly looking back once at the window. "She's going to want to see me," she said. "She'll see you at dinner," Clara said. "That's soon enough." 10. Dinner was a performance, and Abigail Vane was its director. She had changed into an evening dress that must have cost more than Clara's quarterly salary, and she managed the table conversation with the skill of someone who had been trained since birth to make every person in a room feel simultaneously attended to and outmaneuvered. She laughed at the right moments. She asked Mrs. Bellamy about the household with a warmth that was perfectly calibrated enough to be gracious, not so much as to be familiar. She spoke to Nathaniel about Richmond, about mutual acquaintances, about a political situation Clara didn't have enough context to follow, and she did it all with the easy fluency of a woman who knew exactly which frequency Nathaniel Ashford was tuned to. Her mother, Mrs. Vane, was a smaller, older version of the same performance. She smiled when Abigail smiled. She laughed when Abigail laughed. Clara had the unsettling impression of watching a clock and its reflection. Abigail turned to Clara exactly once during the first course with a smile like fresh cream. "Miss Whitcomb, Nathaniel tells me you've come from Boston." "I have," Clara said. "How very brave." The smile didn't move. "Virginia summers must be such a shock to someone accustomed to the North." "I've adapted," Clara said. "Of course you have." Abigail's eyes moved briefly assessingly across Clara's dress, which was clean and decent, and approximately 6 years behind fashion, and returned to her face with an expression of perfect generosity that somehow managed to communicate everything it was pretending not to say. "It's so important in a position like yours to be adaptable." Across the table, Nathaniel said nothing. He was cutting his meat with the focused attention of a man who had decided to be somewhere else inside his own head. Clara smiled back at Abigail Vane, with the pleasantness of a woman who had been underestimated since she was 20 years old, and had learned to be comfortable there. "It is," she agreed. "Fortunately, I've had a great deal of practice." Lydia beside Clara said nothing. She ate her dinner in the methodical way she had, and she did not look at Abigail Vane, and Abigail Vane, with the instincts of a woman who knew which presences were inconvenient, did not look at her. Until she did. "Lydia." Abigail's voice shifted, still warm but different, the warmth of a fire that's been turned toward a specific target. "You've grown so much, you're quite the young lady." Lydia looked up. "Thank you, Miss Vane. I hope you're behaving better than the last time I visited." A small laughing addition. "You were quite the wild thing, if I recall." "I was 4, Lydia said. Abigail reached for her wine glass. "Some things are constitutional, I think." Clara put down her fork. Nathaniel, at the head of the table, looked up. "How is your father, Miss Vane?" Clara said, before the silence could settle into the shape Abigail wanted it to take. Abigail turned to her. The smile reset itself smooth and immediate. "Very well, thank you. He's been occupied with the court session, but he hopes to visit before autumn." "How fortunate," Clara said, and she picked up her fork and resumed eating with the serenity of a woman who has made her point and is satisfied to leave it. Under the table, Lydia's foot pressed once against Clara's ankle. Clara did not look at her. She pressed back. Just once. Just enough. The first morning of Abigail's visit, Clara came downstairs to find her already in the front drawing room with Lydia. She heard it before she reached the door. Not shouting nothing, as honest as shouting. The particular silvery social tone that could deliver any content with a pleasant face. "Your mother was a sweet woman, of course," Abigail was saying. "Everyone thought so, but she was well. She made certain choices about how she lived, about the people she associated with. Choices that a woman in her position perhaps shouldn't have made." Clara opened the door. Lydia was sitting on the small settee with her hands in her lap, her face the color of old paper, perfectly still, the way small animals went still when they understood that moving would make things worse. Abigail was standing near the fireplace holding a teacup, the picture of relaxed conversation. "Miss Whitcomb." Abigail turned with her full brilliant smile. "Good morning." "Good morning." Clara looked at Lydia. "Lydia, lesson time." Lydia stood so fast, she nearly upset the small table beside her. She came to Clara without looking back, and Clara felt the child's hand close around two of her fingers, not holding her hand exactly, just touching the way a person touched something solid to make sure it was still there. "We'll see you at luncheon, Miss Vane," Clara said pleasantly. "Of course." Abigail's smile held. "We'll have plenty of time to continue our little talk, Lydia." Clara walked Lydia out of the room and down the hall toward the stairs, and she did not let go of the two fingers until they were in the schoolroom with the door closed behind them. Then she looked at the child. Lydia was standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and her face arranged in the expression Clara had learned to fear most, the expression of a child who had decided somewhere between the drawing room and here not to feel the thing that was happening to her. The sealed-off look. The going-away look. "Sit down," Clara said quietly. Lydia sat. "Tell me," Clara said. Lydia shook her head. "Lydia." Clara sat across from her, same level, same as always. "What did she say about your mother?" The child's jaw worked. "That she made bad choices," she said finally, in a voice with no color in it. "That some people aren't. That some people are sweet, but they're not. She said Mama wasn't fit for—" She stopped. The sealed-off look cracked just at the edge. "She said Mama's memory embarrasses the family, that it would be better for everyone if I didn't dwell on her so much." The quiet in the room was absolute. Clara breathed in, breathed out. "Lydia," she said, "look at me." The child looked. "Your mother was the woman who read to you every night until you fell asleep and left the book on the table so you'd know she'd been there." Clara's voice was steady and certain, the way a foundation was certain, the way ground was certain. "That is not a woman who embarrasses anyone. That is a good woman. That is a mother who loved her child with everything she had." Lydia's face did the complicated thing, fought it, lost. "Miss Vane said—" "Miss Vane," Clara said carefully, "is a woman who wants something from this household and has decided that your mother is in the way of getting it. That is not a judgment. That is a fact." She held Lydia's eyes. No one has the right to make you ashamed of the person who loved you. Do you understand me?" Lydia was crying, not loudly, the silent kind of crying that Clara had seen before in children who had learned to cry quietly because crying loudly brought the wrong kind of attention. "She's going to marry Uncle Nathaniel," Lydia said. "And then she'll be here all the time, and she'll—" Her voice went very small. "She'll make Mama disappear." "She can't do that," Clara said. "No one can do that. She could take the books. She could—" "Lydia." Clara leaned forward. "Your mother is in you, in your gray eyes, in the way you know the names of 43 plants in this garden, in the way you carved your name in bark just to try, in the way you came to my room the first night and told me about the bookmark." She paused. "Those things cannot be taken from you. Not by Abigail Vane. Not by anyone." Lydia wiped her face with the back of her hand. She sat with that for a moment, breathing. Then she said, "Do you promise?" "I promise," Clara said. It was the kind of promise that had no legal standing and every other kind. She did not go to Nathaniel that day. She thought about it, turned it over, put it down, picked it up again, and finally decided that going to him angry on Lydia's behalf would accomplish less than going to him clearly. She needed to be clear. She needed to be sure. She went the following morning. She knocked on the study door at 7:30 before breakfast, knowing he'd be there. He was always there by 7. She'd figured that out in the first week. He opened the door himself. He looked at her face and something shifted in his immediately. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. "May I come in?" He stepped back. She came in and stood in the middle of the room and told him plainly and in full what Abigail Vane had said to Lydia. Every word she could reconstruct. She didn't editorialize. She didn't raise her voice. She gave him the facts in the order they happened, and then she stopped and waited. Nathaniel stood at the fireplace with his back to her for a long moment after she finished. "She said this to Lydia directly," he said. "Yes." "While I was in the East Study." "Yes." He turned around. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the sealed-off blankness, not the reluctant warmth, but something rawer, something that was making its way through the layers he kept between himself and the world, with considerable difficulty, and no intention of stopping. "This is the second time she's visited," he said. 2 years ago, Lydia came to me after Abigail's first dinner and told me Miss Vane had said that it wasn't healthy for a child to talk about dead people too much. Clara stared at him. "And you said?" "I told Abigail the following morning that Lydia was not a topic for dinner conversation." He said it flatly. "I thought that had concluded it." "It hadn't," Clara said. "Evidently not." He moved away from the fireplace across the room. "Her father and I have had there are arrangements between the families that go back further than I'd like." "I'm not here to tell you who to marry," Clara said and meant it. "No," he said. "You're here to tell me what the consequences of a choice look like." He stopped a few feet from her. "Is she all right, Lydia? She's better than she was yesterday morning. But she told me she's afraid that if Miss Vane becomes part of this household, her mother will disappear from it." Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. "Marion won't disappear," he said, and his voice was very quiet and had things in it that weren't available to him most of the time. "I won't let that happen." "I know," Clara said. "But Lydia doesn't know you know it. She's 7 years old, and she's watching the adults in her life make arrangements about her future, and no one is telling her she's allowed to have feelings about it." He looked at her for a moment. "What would you have me do?" It was the most unguarded question he'd asked her. She could hear it in his voice. Not weakness, not confusion, but the genuine asking of a man who had been managing everything by himself for so long that he'd lost the habit of asking. "Talk to her," Clara said. "Not about Miss Vane, just about Marion. Tell her something about her mother that she doesn't know yet. Something good." She paused. "She's collecting them. The things about her mother that no one else is saving." Nathaniel looked at the floor, then the door, then finally at Clara. "She used to bring in half-drowned creatures from the river," he said. "Marion, when she was young. Birds, frogs once. A rabbit someone's trap had gotten to. She'd nurse them in her room for weeks until they recovered. My father was furious." The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "She saved most of them." "Tell Lydia that," Clara said. He looked at her, and his eyes were doing the thing they did. Sometimes, the thing she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice where he looked at her like she was something he hadn't accounted for and wasn't sure what category to put her in. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "Why are you still here?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Every teacher before you left," he said. "Some were frightened. Some were incompetent. Some decided the work wasn't worth the difficulty." A pause. "What's keeping you?" Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said very honestly, "Lydia is keeping me. And the fact that this house has the bones of something good in it if someone would stop sealing the rooms." He said nothing. She walked to the door. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her hand on the frame. "Miss Whitcomb, whatever you decide about Miss Vane, decide it for the right reasons. Not for the estate, not for Richmond." She met his eyes. "Lydia will know the difference. Children always do." She left him standing in the center of his study, looking like a man who'd been handed a truth he'd been avoiding and had finally run out of room to put it down. The confrontation happened that same afternoon, and Clara was not present for it. She heard about it from Mrs. Bellamy, who had heard through the wall of the east drawing room, not eavesdropping. the housekeeper clarified with dignity, but simply present in the adjacent room when voices became loud enough to be unavoidable. Nathaniel had gone to find Abigail. He'd found her in the garden with her mother, and he'd sent Mrs. Vane inside with a courtesy so absolute that it functioned as a dismissal. Then he and Abigail had been alone. "She didn't deny it," Mrs. Bellamy said, setting the evening's linens down with more force than they required. "Not precisely. She said she'd only been preparing the child for reality, that a girl in Lydia's position needed to understand certain social truths. And he said that Lydia's position was that of a child under his protection, and that her mother's memory was not a social inconvenience to be corrected." Mrs. Bellamy's mouth pressed into a line. "And then he said that he would not be entertaining any further discussion of a future arrangement between the families." Clara was quiet. "He ended it. He did." Mrs. Bellamy looked at her with the direct assessing gaze she only deployed when she'd decided something. She didn't take it well. She said, and I'm giving you her exact words now, so don't attribute them to me. She said that he was letting a charity case from Massachusetts rearrange his household and cloud his judgment. The air in the room went very still. "He said," Mrs. Bellamy continued more quietly, "that Miss Whitcomb was the first person to enter this house in 4 years who had told him the truth without wanting something for it, and that if that was clouded judgment, he'd spent 4 years not seeing clearly." Clara sat down on the chair behind her. She hadn't planned to sit. Her legs decided it. "Then Miss Vane and her mother left for the inn in town," Mrs. Bellamy said. "They'll be gone by morning." Clara said nothing. "He's in the greenhouse," Mrs. Bellamy added with the tone of someone providing logistical information and absolutely nothing else. "He's been there since 4 o'clock." She almost didn't go. She stood in the hallway outside the greenhouse for a long moment, her hand near the latch, arguing with herself in the practical and slightly exhausted way of a woman who knew exactly what she was feeling and couldn't decide whether feeling it was a luxury she could afford. Then she opened the door. The greenhouse was warm and green-smelling and full of the particular hush of living things that weren't doing well. The orange trees were in clay pots along the south wall, their leaves waxy and dark, their root systems visible in places where the soil had compacted hard and wrong. Nathaniel was on his knees beside the largest of them, his coat off, his sleeves rolled up, breaking up the soil around the roots with his bare hands, with the focused private effort of a man who was doing the only thing he knew how to do when the world had gotten too large. He heard her come in. He didn't stop working. "The roots are bound," he said. "I've been trying to—" He stopped. "She planted these. Eleanor, my wife. She brought them as cuttings from her family's estate in Maryland. Said they'd never grow this far south." A beat. "They haven't particularly." Clara walked closer. She crouched down a few feet away, looking at the tree. "They're not dead, though." "No," he said. "Just wrong-soiled. Too compact. No room to spread." He sat back on his heels and looked at his hands dark with soil. "I keep thinking, if I can get the soil right—" He stopped. Clara looked at the side of his face. He was looking at the tree with the expression he usually reserved for keeping himself from looking at anything, the sealed-off expression, but used this time not against the world, but against himself. "Nathaniel," she said. His name, just that. She hadn't used it before. She hadn't meant to use it now. He turned and looked at her. "What she said?" Clara said. "About me. About clouded judgment." "Don't," he said. "I'm not— I need you to know that whatever you decide, it shouldn't be on account of Clara." Her name, his voice, the quiet, complete, unarguable way he said it stopped everything in the room. He looked at her for a moment with his hands covered in soil and his sleeves rolled up and all of his considerable armor in disarray, and he said, "The last afternoon we worked in here together. You were helping me with the pots. It was raining outside. Do you remember?" She remembered. 2 weeks ago. He'd come into the greenhouse while she was reading nearby. Hadn't told her to leave. Hadn't invited her in either. Just worked beside her in the natural way of two people who had gotten used to each other's silences. She'd held one pot, while he'd packed the new soil in, and they'd worked for an hour without speaking more than a dozen words. "Yes," she said. "I remember." "What did you feel?" he asked. During it was the most direct question he had ever asked her. She understood somehow that it had cost him. She looked at the orange tree. She looked at the soil on his hands. She looked at the space that had been between them that afternoon, close enough to work far enough to pretend they weren't choosing it. "Peace," she said. "I felt peace." She stopped. "For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in a place where I was allowed to be exactly what I was." He looked at her. The greenhouse was very quiet. "I don't know what to do with that," he said, not dishonestly, genuinely. The admission of a man who had managed everything by categories and found that some things refused to fit. "Neither do I," Clara said. "So for now we don't do anything with it. We just know it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the tree. He pressed the soil back around the roots with careful hands. "The roots need room," he said. "That's all. Not perfect soil, just room." "Yes," Clara said. "That's usually all anything needs." They stayed there in the warm greenhouse the summer evening, pressing gold against the glass walls until the light changed, and Mrs. Bellamy's voice calling the household to dinner drifted in from somewhere across the lawn. Neither of them mentioned what had happened in the space between them. They didn't need to. Some things once said took root on their own. The morning after Abigail Vane's carriage rolled out of the Ashford Hall drive, the house was different. Not quieter, it had always been quiet, but differently quiet. The way a room felt after someone had opened a window that had been sealed shut for years, letting in air that made you realize how stale everything had gotten without you noticing. Mrs. Bellamy made biscuits for breakfast. Real ones, the kind that took time, not the quick flat ones she produced on mornings when the household was operating under strain. Lydia ate 3 of them, which was the most food Clara had seen the child consume at a single sitting. Thomas, the stable boy, who had no particular reason to be in the kitchen hallway at 7 in the morning, appeared there anyway, and spent approximately 20 minutes reorganizing a row of hooks that had not required reorganizing, whistling something tuneless and cheerful. Nathaniel came to breakfast on time, which he did not always do, and he sat down across from Lydia and said without preamble, "Your mother once nursed a half-drowned crow back to health in her room for 6 weeks when she was 9 years old. My father didn't find out until the crow started talking." Lydia stared at him. Talking. It had learned to say good morning, and one word I won't repeat at this table. His face was doing the thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was reaching toward it across a considerable distance. "My father was not pleased." Marion cried. "The crow said good morning to him, and he forgave her on the spot." Lydia was silent for a full 3 seconds. Then, "She never told me that." "You were 3 when she died," he said quietly. "There wasn't time for all of it." Lydia looked down at her plate. Her jaw worked. "I want to know the rest," she said. "There's more?" "Everything," she said. "I want to know everything." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment, this small, serious child who had his sister's eyes and his sister's particular brand of stubborn, quiet courage, and something in his face settled into a new configuration, like a bone that had been set wrong finally finding the right alignment. "All right," he said. "I reckon we've got time." Clara drank her coffee and said absolutely nothing, and was privately grateful beyond her capacity to express it. The letter came 11 days later. It arrived in the Morning Post with 3 other pieces of correspondence, none of which Clara had been expecting. It was addressed in an attorney's hand, formal, precise, the penmanship of a man who charged by the letter, and took the work seriously from a firm in Philadelphia. Clara read it at the desk in her room while Lydia was in the garden with Thomas, learning apparently how to assess a horse's gait, which was not on any lesson plan Clara had written, but which she had decided counted as practical mathematics. She read the letter once. Then she read it again. Then she set it down and stared at the wall for a full 2 minutes. Her great-aunt Prudence, her mother's father's sister. A woman Clara had met exactly 4 times in her life, the last time at a funeral when Clara was 14, had died in June in Philadelphia. She had never married. She had managed her money with the quiet ferocity of a woman who understood that money was the only armor available to her gender, and she had managed it very well indeed. And for reasons the letter did not elaborate on, reasons that Clara suspected had to do with the fact that Prudence had watched Clara's mother surrender every financial independence she'd ever had the moment she married, and had decided that at least one woman in the next generation should not have to. She had left the whole of her modest estate to Clara. Not a fortune, not land, but enough. Enough to live on carefully for several years. Enough to rent a building. Enough to open a school. Clara sat with her hands flat on the desk and breathed. She was aware with this particular clarity that came from genuinely unexpected news that this changed something fundamental. Not about what she felt. She had been trying not to examine that too closely with mixed results, but about what those feelings meant. About whether they were hers freely chosen, or whether they were the feelings of a woman with $11 and one trunk who needed a place to be. She needed to know the difference. She needed to know it for herself before anything else. She folded the letter, put it in the small cedar box where she kept her father's portrait and the pressed wildflower, and went down to teach the afternoon lesson. She didn't tell anyone that day. She told Mrs. Bellamy on Thursday. She told her in the kitchen in the practical privacy of two women occupied with tasks, Clara shelling beans, Mrs. Bellamy doing something complicated to a joint of meat because some conversations were easier when your hands were busy. "There's a letter," Clara said, "from an attorney in Philadelphia. My great-aunt Prudence left me an inheritance." Mrs. Bellamy's hands paused for exactly 1/2 second, then resumed. Significant, modest, but real. Clara set a handful of shells aside. Enough to open a school, somewhere, not large, but mine. Silence in the kitchen. The good kind, the kind where a person was actually thinking rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. "And what will you do?" Mrs. Bellamy asked finally. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. The housekeeper looked at her sideways, in the way she had, the way that communicated full comprehension of everything being said and a good deal of what wasn't. "He's going to Richmond next week," she said with the tone of someone providing weather information. "I know," Clara said. She'd heard Nathaniel mention it at dinner, estate business, something with a lawyer about the old Marchland situation, the tangle of political and financial difficulty that Mrs. Bellamy had alluded to, her first week, the thing that had brought him home from Richmond to begin with. "He's been different," Mrs. Bellamy said. "Since she left. Since—" A pause. "Since the greenhouse." Clara shelled another bean. "People adjust," she said. "Clara." Mrs. Bellamy put down the knife. She only used first names when she meant business. "I have worked in this house for 19 years. I worked for his father before him. I watched Eleanor come and go, God rest her. I watched Marion come and go, and I pray God rests her too." She looked at Clara directly. "I have not in 19 years seen that man bring a book to a child's lesson and not sign his name to it." The kitchen was very quiet. "That doesn't mean anything," Clara said. "It means something," Mrs. Bellamy said with the absolute conviction of a woman who had been paying attention for 19 years. "What it means is the question." Clara looked at the bowl of beans in her lap. Outside, she could hear Lydia's voice carrying from the stable yard high and clear and arguing with Thomas about something horse-related with the particular confidence of a child who had recently read 2 chapters about horse breeds and considered herself an authority. "I need to know what I'd be choosing," Clara said finally. "And why?" Mrs. Bellamy looked at her for a moment. Then she picked the knife back up and returned to the joint of meat. "Good," she said. "That's the right question. Make sure you get the right answer." Nathaniel left for Richmond on a Monday. He told Clara at Sunday dinner that he expected to be gone 10 days to 2 weeks, that Mrs. Bellamy had full authority over the household in his absence, and that Lydia's lessons should continue as scheduled. He said this in the organized, precise way he handled practical matters, and then he paused and then he said in a slightly different register, "She's been sleeping better." Clara looked up from her plate. "Lydia," he clarified. "Mrs. Bellamy mentioned it. She used to wake at night bad dreams. She hasn't the past 2 weeks." "She's been reading herself to sleep," Clara said. "The river book." Something moved through his face. "The one from the windowsill." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "It's my job," Clara said. "No," he said, and his voice was quiet and certain. "It's more than your job. And I think you know that." She held his gaze for exactly as long as she trusted herself to. "Have a safe journey, Mr. Ashford," she said. He left in the morning before she came down to breakfast. There was a note beside her coffee cup, just 2 lines in his spare, precise handwriting, the Cumberland chapter in the blue atlas on the second shelf. "Lydia hasn't found it yet. It has better maps. No signature." Clara held the note for a long moment. Then she tucked it into her pocket and went to find Lydia. The 10 days Nathaniel was gone were the longest and the clearest of Clara's time at Ashford Hall. Clear because without him in the house, she could examine what his presence had been doing to her thinking with the objectivity of distance. She could look at the note in her pocket and the books on the windowsill and the conversation in the greenhouse and the way he'd said her name Clara, like it was something he'd been careful with, and she could ask herself the honest question, not does he feel something? She knew the answer to that, had known it for a while, in the way you knew the weather was changing before the sky showed it. The honest question was, what do you want, Clara Whitcomb? Not what do you need. Not what is available to you. What do you actually want? She had the inheritance now. She had options that didn't exist 3 weeks ago. She could open a school in Philadelphia or Boston. She could go back north. She could build something entirely her own, answerable to no one, beholden to nothing. She lay awake 3 nights in a row, working through it, with the systematic honesty of a woman who had always believed in clear accounting. And on the 4th morning, she woke up and knew. She knew because she had dreamed about the greenhouse, not Nathaniel specifically. Just the greenhouse. The orange trees with their roots bound wrong. The warm green smell of things fighting toward better soil. The way the afternoon light came through the glass and made everything look like it was trying. She knew because Lydia came to breakfast that morning with the river book under her arm, and sat down and started reading aloud, to no one in particular, just reading, because she wanted to, her voice steady and clear and sure. And Clara felt something in her chest that was bigger than professional satisfaction, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. She knew because when Mrs. Bellamy mentioned at dinner that Mr. Ashford had sent word he'd be back by Friday, Clara's heartbeat did something she didn't authorize it to do. The inheritance didn't change what she felt. It clarified it. It cleaned it. It meant that when she walked toward something, she was walking toward it with her eyes open and her feet under her, not running from something else. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. Nathaniel came back on a Thursday, which was 1 day early. Clara was in the schoolroom with Lydia working through a letter Lydia had decided to write on her own initiative with no suggestion from Clara, to a natural history society in Philadelphia, requesting information about riverbirds of the Virginia region. It was the most ambitious piece of writing the child had attempted, and she'd been at it for 40 minutes with a focus that Clara hadn't seen her sustain before, and she was doing very well, and Clara had the wisdom not to say so out loud, in case she broke the spell. She heard the carriage on the gravel below. Lydia heard it too. Her pen stopped. Clara said, "Keep going. You're on the 3rd paragraph." Lydia looked at her. Then she looked back at the paper. Then she picked up the pen and kept going. Clara listened to the sounds from downstairs voices in the entrance hall. Mrs. Bellamy's efficient welcome, the familiar particular weight of Nathaniel's footsteps on the flagstone floor. She waited for the footsteps to go toward the study. They didn't. They came upstairs. Lydia's pen slowed. She was very studiously not looking at the door. The knock, when it came, was at the correct measured distance, not the tentative, almost knock of someone uncertain about their right to be there. A full, clear knock. "Come in," Clara said. He looked different. Not dramatically so, not thinner or older or changed in any way a stranger would notice. But there was something about him that had shifted in the 2 weeks, a quality of the way he carried himself, that Clara, who had been paying careful attention, clocked immediately. He looked like a man who had decided something, and was at peace with the decision, which was different from the man who had left, who had looked like a man who was working up to deciding. "Lydia," he said. Lydia looked up from her letter with the careful nonchalance of a child who had been listening for exactly that voice for exactly 2 weeks and had decided not to appear to have been doing so. "Uncle Nathaniel," she said. He crossed the room and bent to look at the paper on her desk. He read the first paragraph, then the second. His face did the new thing, the thing that was reaching toward the old smile and occasionally arriving. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Miss Whitcomb helped with the date and the salutation," Lydia said. "The rest is mine." "Dear Sir," he read aloud from the third paragraph. "I am 7 years old, and I have read 2 chapters about river birds, and I believe I have found a discrepancy in the illustration on page 44, which I would respectfully like to bring to your attention." He stopped. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Clara. "She found a discrepancy." "She did?" Clara said. "She's correct about it, too." Nathaniel looked back at the letter. Something in his expression settled into the new configuration, the right one, the one that fit his face better than the old sealed-off blankness, even if he was still learning how to wear it. "Keep going," he told Lydia in the quiet, specific voice he'd been developing for her. "Finish it." He walked to the door. He stopped at the frame. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "when you have a moment, my study." "Of course," Clara said. He left. Lydia waited approximately 5 seconds and then said without looking up from her letter, "He came back early." "He did," Clara said. "He never comes back early." Another 5 seconds. "He came back a whole day early." "Lydia," Clara said. Third paragraph. Lydia bent over her letter, but she was very carefully not smiling, which was its own kind of smile. She went to the study at 4 o'clock. He was standing at the window, not at the fireplace, not at the desk, but the window, which she'd never seen him use before, and she understood instinctively that it meant something about where he was putting himself in relation to the room. "Sit down," he said without turning. "I'll stand, I think," Clara said, "if you don't mind." He turned, looked at her. "All right." A pause. He was working up to it. She could see the machinery of it, a careful man making sure he'd assembled the right words in the right order. "There was a letter waiting for me in Richmond," he said. "From Patterson. He'd written ahead of me, I don't know when." His jaw tightened briefly. He had written to suggest to my cousin that the schoolmistress arrangement had become his phrase, was a complicating influence, and that it might be prudent to revisit the terms of your employment. Clara went very still. "I see. I want you to know," Nathaniel said, "that I have terminated Patterson's employment." The quiet that followed was thorough. "Nathaniel." He overstepped. Nathaniel said simply, "He has been overstepping for years in smaller ways that I tolerated because he was efficient. This I won't tolerate." "He wasn't entirely wrong," Clara said carefully. "About the complication. He was wrong about everything that matters." He moved away from the window. "He was wrong to presume. He was wrong to go behind me. And he was wrong to use the word influence as though it was a problem to be solved." He stopped a few feet from her. "Your influence on this household has been the first genuinely good thing to happen to it in 4 years. I will not hear it named as a problem." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you." "All right. I've received an inheritance from an aunt in Philadelphia." She held his gaze. "It's modest, but it's enough. Enough to open a school of my own. Enough to be not dependent on any position or any person." She paused. "I'm telling you because you should know, before anything else." He was very still. "Before anything else," he repeated. Yes. Something moved through his face. Not disappointment, she realized. Almost the opposite. Something that looked like relief, which confused her until he said, "Good." She blinked. "Good, good." He said it again, steady. "I have been working out how to say what I'm going to say to you for 2 weeks, and the version I kept rejecting was the one where you had no other option. Where the circumstances of your position made what I wanted to ask into something that looked like an offer of rescue." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to rescue you, Clara. I want to—" He stopped. "I want to ask you something that you are completely free to refuse, that you would be completely fine refusing. That changes nothing about your situation either way." Her heart was doing the unauthorized thing again. She let it. "Ask," she said. He took a breath. "I'd like you to stay. As Lydia's teacher. As—" He stopped. Tried again. "Lydia needs you. This house needs you." A pause. "I need you, though I'm aware that's the least compelling argument I could make, given that I've spent 4 months demonstrating an extraordinary capacity for being difficult." Clara said nothing. She waited. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the estate. Not because of Richmond or the family name or what it would look like to the county. Because you are the most honest person I have met in I don't know how long. And because you looked at a frightened child in a locked-up house and didn't run. And because you told me the truth in rooms where no one had told me the truth in years, and because—" He stopped. "Because I felt peace," he said quietly. "That afternoon in the greenhouse, you used that word, peace. I didn't know until I heard you say it that I'd been feeling it too." The room was very quiet. "I have conditions," Clara said. He waited. "I will not be a decorative wife," she said. "I will not manage your household and attend your dinners and exist as an ornament to your respectability." She looked at him steadily. "I will open my school, here or nearby, for girls whose families can't afford fashionable academies. It will be mine, my name on the door, my decisions about how it runs." "Yes," he said. "Of course. I'll help raise Lydia, genuinely, not as a governess, not as staff, as someone she can come to." "She already does," he said. "I know." Clara held his gaze. "And I will tell you the truth. Whenever you need it, and sometimes when you don't want it. That won't stop." Something crossed his face that was unambiguously a smile, not the ghost of one, not the shape of one, but the real thing. And it changed his face so completely that Clara almost forgot what she was saying. "I would be disappointed if it did," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had left books on windowsills without his name, who had crouched in the wet gravel in his good coat to check on his niece, who had said she felt peace in a voice that acknowledged it had cost him something to keep. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right? Yes," she said. "I'll stay, on those terms." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her hand. Not grandly, not dramatically. Just her hand held carefully the way you held something you understood the value of. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Clara said. "We still have to tell Lydia." The look on his face was the best thing she'd seen in a long time. Dawn. They told Lydia at dinner. Nathaniel told her clearly, and without embellishment, that he had asked Miss Whitcomb to stay at Ashford Hall permanently, and that she had agreed. Lydia put down her fork. She looked at Clara, then at her uncle, then at Clara again with the particular assessment of a child who was checking for the version that was too good and therefore suspect. "Permanently," she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Not like a teacher." "Not only like a teacher." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Clara, in the direct and serious way she'd had since the very first night, "You're not going to disappear." It wasn't a question. It was a requirement. "No," Clara said. "I'm not." Lydia picked up her fork. She took a bite of her dinner. She chewed it with the composure of someone who had been maintaining composure under difficult conditions for some time and was accustomed to the effort. Then she said completely casually, in the tone of someone raising an entirely unrelated topic, "The Natural History Society in Philadelphia sent a pamphlet once. Mrs. Bellamy has it in the library. It mentions a survey of Virginia river birds from 1811. "Does it?" Clara said. "It does. I thought we might look at it tomorrow, for the letter." "We might," Clara agreed. Nathaniel looked across the table at Clara with that new expression on his face, the one that fit right, the one that acknowledged something the previous version of him hadn't had language for. She looked back. Outside, the late summer evening was beginning to cool the Virginia air, settling into the particular golden shadow that happened in the hour before dark, and somewhere in the East Garden, a mockingbird was going through its repertoire with the absolute confidence of something that had no doubts about its right to be exactly where it was. Mrs. Bellamy appeared in the doorway and looked at the three of them at the table at Lydia eating her dinner with her river pamphlet ambitions, and her whole unruined future ahead of her at Nathaniel. Sitting like a man who had finally put down something very heavy at Clara, and the housekeeper's expression did something small and private that she immediately recovered from. "More biscuits?" she asked. "Please," said all three of them at the same moment. And Mrs. Bellamy went to get them with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman who had waited 19 years for a dinner table to sound exactly like that. The wedding was small, which was exactly what both of them wanted and what the county found deeply suspicious. No formal ball, no announcement in the Richmond papers, no procession of carriages down the long oak drive with half the Virginia gentry in attendance, waiting to evaluate the match and render their verdict over supper. Nathaniel had suggested a quiet ceremony at the local church, and Clara had agreed before he finished the sentence, and Mrs. Bellamy had produced a breakfast afterward that managed to be both modest and the finest thing she'd ever cooked, which was saying something. Lydia wore a white ribbon in her hair and stood between them during the ceremony with the focused gravity of someone assigned an important post and determined to discharge it with honor. When the Reverend reached the part about rings, she produced Nathaniel's from her left coat pocket. She'd been holding it for safekeeping and handed it over with such professional seriousness that the Reverend almost lost his place. Afterward, walking back to the house in the September morning, Lydia took Clara's left hand and Nathaniel's right and walked between them without saying anything. She didn't need to. The gesture said everything she'd have needed 100 words to build up to, and she was at 8 years old already smart enough to know when silence did better work than speech. Clara felt the small, warm hand in hers and thought about a muddy carriage road in the spring rain, and a horse rearing, and a child running toward danger, and the particular way the world sometimes turned on. A moment so small you didn't know it was happening until you were already on the other side of it. She tightened her grip. Lydia tightened back. Nathaniel on the other side said nothing. But his hand where it held Lydia's was easy and open, and that was its own kind of speech. Battle. The school opened in October. Clara had found the building herself, a former dry goods store 2 miles from Ashford Hall on the main road through the nearest township, with good windows on the south side, and a room in the back that had once been a storage space and could be cleared for a second classroom when the enrollment grew. She had negotiated the lease herself, paid the first quarter herself from Aunt Prudence's money, and she had stood in the empty building alone the morning after signing the papers and said out loud to the bare walls, "All right then." The walls didn't answer, but they felt solid under her hand when she pressed it to the plaster. That was enough. She named it simply the Whitcomb School for Girls because she'd earned the name and intended to keep it regardless of whose household she now slept in. Nathaniel had not suggested otherwise. He had in fact driven her to the township to see the building the first time, waited outside in the carriage while she inspected it and asked only one question when she came back out. "Is it right?" "It's right," she'd said. "Good," he'd said, and turned the carriage back toward home. The first week of enrollment brought 4 students. 2 were daughters of local farmers who couldn't afford the fashionable academy in Richmond and had been told variously that their girls didn't need more education than a kitchen could provide. 1 was a girl of 10 whose father was a doctor and who had quietly terrified every tutor they'd hired with the speed of her comprehension. The 4th was a girl of 12 who arrived alone, having walked 3 miles in thin shoes, and told Clara in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake that she'd heard there was a school that didn't charge more than a family could manage, and she had 3 pennies and a written character from her minister, and she wanted to learn to read well enough to write letters. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Bess," the girl said. "Bess Conroy." "Can you read at all, Bess?" "A little. Slow." "We all start slow," Clara said, and showed her where to sit. By December there were 11 students. By February there were 17. Clara taught Monday through Friday, returned to Ashford Hall for dinner, and spent her evenings planning the following day's lessons at the desk in what had been the spare room, and was now the most organized space in the house. Nathaniel sometimes came to the doorway of that room in the evenings, and leaned against the frame the way he'd leaned against doorways for years, watching from the edge of things. Except now, it didn't mean he was keeping distance. It meant he was content to be nearby without requiring anything from the nearness. "You're doing that thing again," Clara said one evening without looking up from her lesson plan. "What thing?" "Doorway thing. Come in or go away. You're letting the heat out." He came in. He sat in the chair beside the fireplace and picked up a book from the table without making a point of it, and they spent the next hour in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms well enough to be quiet inside them. That was the ordinary version of things, the everyday version. Clara had not known before this how much she'd wanted ordinary, how much a person could want it after years of making do. Artigue. The first real test came in November. It arrived in the form of a letter not from Abigail Vane, whose absence had become a permanent and unremarked upon feature of Ashford Hall's social landscape, but from Nathaniel's cousin in Richmond, a Mr. Gerald Ashford, who signed his letters with a flourish that suggested he thought well of himself, and whose correspondence Clara had gathered from prior mentions was the kind that arrived wrapped in courtesy and left a bruise. Nathaniel read the letter at breakfast without changing expression. He folded it. He set it beside his coffee cup. He looked at Clara. "Gerald is coming to visit," he said. "When?" "He hasn't said. Which means soon." A pause. "He's heard about the school." Clara put down her fork. "And he has opinions." Nathaniel said it flatly. "He believes a woman in your position should be directing her energies toward the household. He finds the school." He stopped. His word was eccentric. "His word is gentle," Clara said. "It was the first letter. They escalate." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know before he arrived, so nothing he says catches you unprepared." "Nothing he says will change anything," Clara said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I wanted to say so first, before he gets here and I'm required to be diplomatic." She looked at him across the breakfast table. This man who had once run his estate from behind a locked expression and had not, she suspected, told anyone anything they didn't need to know in years, and felt the particular warmth of being with someone who thought to tell you things in advance. Who trusted you with the information before it became a problem. Who said I wanted you to know as naturally as breathing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said in the dry tone he used when he was trying not to be gentle. "I'm also going to need you not to say anything to Gerald that gets me uninvited from the Richmond Bar Association." "I make no promises," Clara said. He made the sound that was still working toward being a laugh. She was keeping count. She was at 14 since March. Gerald Ashford arrived on a Wednesday. Same as Abigail Vane, Clara noted, and decided Wednesdays were not her day, and he was exactly what his letters had prepared her for, a man of 45 who had the confident, broad-shouldered look of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room and had organized his personality accordingly. He was not unkind precisely. He was the kind of man who had never needed to be unkind, because he could accomplish the same result with enough condescension delivered at sufficient volume. He called Nathaniel Nat, which Nathaniel did not correct, and which Clara could see cost him something. He called Clara Mrs. Ashford, with an emphasis that somehow managed to convey skepticism in 2 syllables. He found her in the east hallway on his second morning and said pleasantly, with the air of a man raising a topic he'd been magnanimous enough to delay, until now, "Nat tells me you've opened a little school." "I have," Clara said. "For girls." "That's right." "From local families?" "Primarily, yes." Gerald nodded with the considered look of a man about to dispense wisdom that he felt the situation required. "It's an admirable impulse," he said. "Charity work has a long tradition in families such as ours, but one does have to be careful about the—" He paused. "The signal it sends, about how the household is managed, about priorities." "Whose priorities?" Clara asked. He blinked. He hadn't expected to be interrupted. "I beg your pardon. You said priorities. I'm asking whose you mean." She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention she'd developed over years of teaching rooms full of people who thought they knew better than her. "Because my priorities are quite clear to me. 17 girls are learning to read, write, and reason with sufficient skill to manage their own affairs. That seems like a useful way to spend an October." Gerald looked at her for a moment. "That's very— If you're concerned about the household," Clara continued, "Mrs. Bellamy runs it more efficiently than I ever could, and has been doing so for 19 years. If you're concerned about Nathaniel, he had me review the estate accounts last month, and I found a clerical error in the ledger that Patterson had been carrying forward for 2 years, so I'd say the household management is in order." She paused. "And if you're concerned about how it looks, I reckon Richmond will survive the sight of a woman running a school. It has survived worse." The hallway was very quiet. Gerald Ashford looked at her the way men looked at things they'd underestimated and were too proud to admit to. Then he straightened his coat. "You're forthright," he said. "I've been told that," Clara said, "generally by people who meant it as a complaint." He left for Richmond the following morning 1 day early. On his way out, he shook Nathaniel's hand and said in Clara's hearing, and apparently with full intention that she should hear it, "She'll do, Nat. Lord knows she'll do." It was the closest thing to a compliment Gerald Ashford was apparently capable of producing without surgery, and Nathaniel accepted it with the expression of a man containing a considerable amount of satisfaction. When the carriage was gone, he turned to Clara and said, "Clerical error in the ledger." $214 over 3 years, Clara said. "I left the accounting on your desk." He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "I am extremely glad you are on my side." "So am I," Clara said, and went to school. The twist came on a Sunday in December, and it came from the direction Clara least expected. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Bellamy after the Sunday service, when Lydia came in from the garden with mud on her boots and a letter in her hand, held out at arm's length with the careful reverence of someone transporting something important. "This was by the garden gate," Lydia said, "wedged in the post." Clara took it. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, small and cramped, and uncertain in the way of someone not accustomed to writing much. No seal, just her name. She opened it. It was from Bess Conroy, the girl who had walked 3 miles in thin shoes with 3 pennies and a minister's character. The girl who had wanted to learn to read well enough to write letters. The letter was short. The handwriting was still cramped, but it was clear, each letter formed with concentration, each word built with care. Clara could see in the structure of it all the weeks of practice, all the mornings of sitting at the back desk and working through it with the stubbornness of someone who had decided that this was the thing she needed and was going to get it. "Dear Mrs. Ashford," it read, "I am writing to tell you that I have written a letter to my brother in Kentucky. It is 3 pages long. I wrote it myself. I wanted you to know because you are the reason I can. I am going to keep coming to school if that is all right. I think I would like to learn mathematics next. Respectfully, Bess Conroy." Clara stood in the kitchen and read it twice. Mrs. Bellamy looked at her face and said nothing, which was the right response. Lydia said, "Is it bad news?" "No," Clara said. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket next to the old note about the Cumberland Atlas that she'd been carrying since October because she hadn't been able to make herself put it away. It's the best news I've had in a long time." She went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the greenhouse, where else on his knees in the soil working at the roots of the largest orange tree, and she crouched down beside him and read him the letter out loud. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, his hands still in the soil. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "3 pages," he said. "3 pages," she said. He looked at the orange tree. Then he looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did sometimes in the greenhouse, the unguarded thing, the thing that the house walls and the study fire and the county dinner table never got to see. "You built that," he said. "You built that girl's ability to write 3 pages to her brother." "She built it," Clara said. "I just cleared the soil a little." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who understood finally and fully what he had in his house. Not an ornament, not a charity case from Massachusetts, not a complicating influence. A woman who cleared soil and gave things room and watched them grow toward what they'd always been capable of. He took her hand, soil and all. She let him hold it. The Sunday came in late February when Lydia read aloud in church. It wasn't planned. The Reverend had asked at the end of the previous week's service if any of the young people of the congregation would like to read the opening scripture the following Sunday. He'd said it generally to the room the way these invitations were made, expecting probably the older children, the ones from families who pushed their sons forward for such things. Lydia had raised her hand. Nathaniel had gone very still beside her. Clara on his other side had kept her face forward and her hands folded and said nothing, because Lydia had not looked at either of them before she raised her hand. She had made the decision on her own, and that was the whole point. The Reverend had said yes naturally. That week, Lydia practiced every morning, not with Clara on her own in the schoolroom, the door shut. Clara had walked past twice and heard the low, careful sound of a child reading the same verse again and again, working the words until they stopped being obstacles and became just words. Sunday morning, she ate her breakfast without speaking. She wore the white ribbon again. She sat in the pew between Nathaniel and Clara with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set in the line that was unmistakably the Ashford line. When the time came, she walked to the front of the church alone. She was small. She was 8 years old. She stood at the wooden lectern with the Bible open before her, and she looked up once at the congregation. Not at Nathaniel, not at Clara. Just at the room taking its measure. The way her uncle took the measure of rooms he'd decided to walk into. And then she looked down at the page. She read. Her voice was clear and steady and entirely her own. She read without stumbling, without rushing, without the frozen quality that had gripped her every time letters became a test or a punishment, or a reminder of something taken away. She read because she chose to, in a voice that didn't apologize for itself. And when she reached the end of the verse, she closed the Bible and walked back to the pew and sat down. The congregation exhaled. Nathaniel put his hand over hers, where it rested on the pew. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Lydia turned her hand over and held his back, and the small transaction of it, the reaching and the caught, was the quietest and most complete thing Clara had witnessed since a child had pressed her foot against Clara's ankle under a dinner table and trusted her to press back. Clara looked straight ahead and breathed. She was not, she would tell no one, entirely steady about it. The orange trees bloomed in the greenhouse on a Thursday in March. Nathaniel found it first, or rather he'd been waiting for it, checking every morning in the particular way of a man who had refused to stop believing in something that kept not happening. He came to find Clara in the schoolroom, not at the doorway this time, not lingering at the edge. All the way in past the rearranged chairs and the map of American rivers on the wall, and Lydia's latest letter to the Natural History Society, which they had answered twice now, and invited her to correspond further with the results of her river bird observations. "Come," he said. She looked at his face. Now, he said. She set down her pen and followed him. The greenhouse was warm and smelled like green things and turned earth, and underneath it, something new, something sweet and sharp and particular. Nathaniel stopped inside the door. Clara came in beside him. The largest orange tree was flowering, not lavishly, not dramatically. Not the sudden explosion of a plant that had been storing up for years. Just 3 blossoms, small and white and perfect, on the branch closest to the south-facing glass. But real, alive, evidence. "Well," Clara said. "Well," he said. They stood looking at it for a moment. "New soil," Clara said. "And room," he agreed. Lydia appeared in the doorway behind them. She had followed, apparently, which was characteristic, and pushed between them to see what they were looking at. She stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at the 3 white blossoms with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. "They bloomed," she said. "They did," Nathaniel said. "I thought they might never." She reached out and touched the edge of one blossom with one careful fingertip. "Mrs. Bellamy said they'd been dying since before I was born." "They weren't dying," Clara said. "Just wrong-soiled." Lydia looked at the tree for another moment. Then she turned and went to the shelf where Clara kept the spare lesson books. There was a shelf in the greenhouse now because Lydia had started treating it as a secondary schoolroom approximately 6 weeks after the wedding, and no one had objected. And she picked up the Green River book, the one that had been on the windowsill the very first morning, the one with the maps of the James and the Ohio and the Cumberland. She sat down on the low stool that had appeared in the greenhouse at some point and could not be accounted for, opened the book and began to read. Not to them. Not for an audience. Just reading the way people breathed, because it was what she did now, because it was hers, because the door she'd kept sealed for 4 years was open, and she had found on the other side of it not loss, but the opposite. Nathaniel stood beside Clara in the warm greenhouse with the orange blossoms, and the sound of a child reading, and the particular quality of March light coming through the old glass, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "I didn't know it could feel like this." "Like what?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his niece, and at the flowering tree, and at the life that had accumulated in this house of locked rooms, patient as roots in new soil. "Like I live here," he said. Clara looked at the side of his face, at the jaw that had unclenched, at the eyes that had stopped guarding themselves, at the man who had left books on windowsills without his name, because he hadn't known yet how to ask for what he needed, and had found in the asking that it was already there. She took his hand. "You do," she said. "You live here. We all do." And that was the truth of it. The whole truth, plain and solid and without qualification. The kind that didn't need ornament or argument, or the approval of Richmond, or the memory of locked doors and sealed rooms. The schoolmistress from Massachusetts, who had come with $11 and one worn trunk, had not rescued the feared widower of Ashford Hall. She had not been rescued by him. They had together and separately done the harder and less dramatic work of showing up honestly day after day in the rooms they'd been afraid to enter until the house understood that it was allowed to be inhabited, and the people in it understood the same about themselves. The orange trees bloomed in the greenhouse that March, and they would bloom again the following year and the year after that, because nothing that has been given room and honest tending stays barren forever. Not trees, not children, not the hearts of people who have been hurt into silence and are offered at last the extraordinary chance to speak. Lydia read the first line of the new chapter without looking up. Nathaniel did not look like a man guarding a locked door. He looked like someone who had finally completely and without reservation come home.